Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's an honor and a thrill to be part of this remarkable 10th anniversary conference celebrating Wayne State's Center for the Study of Citizenship, so ably directed by Mark Crewman and skillfully administered by Helen Callow and others. My thanks to them and to you. The array of scholarship on different dimensions of citizenship in this program is dazzling. And I look forward to hearing, participating in, and learning from as many discussions as I can, even though, due to my own bad planning, I must leave temporarily right after this session. Like General MacArthur, I shall return. Like that comparison, my presumption today is a bit presumptuous. The questions facing citizenship today. I mean it not as a set of oracular pronouncements, but rather as a way to kick off a dialogue in which you may persuade me to modify what I say. I have been studying citizenship a long time, more than 30 years, and in the last half dozen years I have directed an interdisciplinary program focused partly on citizenship. So based on these experiences, I will dare to undertake this morning a mapping of the citizenship big picture. I will lay out what I see as the main questions facing both scholars of citizenship and practitioners of citizenship in the 21st century. Then, in discussion, we can identify the biggest things I get wrong or miss, and the discussion may help us all to define agendas as we move forward. That's my hope. As a preliminary matter, for this audience, I only need to note briefly that there are many definitions of citizenship, including legal membership that entitles one to hold a passport from a nation state, persons who are entitled to rule as well as be ruled within some sort of democratic or republican regime, persons who as a sociological matter are members of communities of shared fate, whatever their legal statuses in those communities. Persons who engage in active service in virtually any type of human association, whether political, civil, private, or even divine, as in St. Augustine's City of God. And citizenship also means persons who simply are members of such associations. In common parlance, all these identities and statuses and more are sometimes called citizens. Though we may rightly identify different conceptions as our specific concerns in particular analyses, I suggest we cannot avoid the fact that any and all uses of the term citizens and citizenship will often tacitly invoke a whole range of other meanings of these terms. So the broad endeavor of studying citizenship cannot rule any of these meanings wholly out of consideration. To try to do so probably means that we will fail to grasp important dimensions of the phenomena of citizenship we profess to be focusing on in our work. As a second preliminary, I presume we all agree that all different forms of membership, activity, and identity that we may call citizenship are products of social and political processes of construction, and indeed, all are also always part of processes of continuing and changing social and political construction and demolition. We are not settled on just how to theorize those processes, and we face a daunting array of empirical questions in describing and explaining them, as well as a perhaps still more daunting array of normative questions when we seek to evaluate those processes and the forms of citizenship they have generated and are generating. But we can agree, I presume, that we scholars of citizenship are engaged in a shared endeavor of trying to understand and/or evaluate the social and political processes through which the many things called citizenship are created and changed, an endeavor that holds the promise of helping us and others to think how we might best live the forms of citizenship that are available to us or that we can hope to create. My comments today seek to identify what are, in my humble opinion, the main questions facing those of us who are engaged in these endeavors of inquiry and of life choice today in the still new 21st century. I will identify and discuss 4 big questions of citizenship that I think loom larger and more pressing now than perhaps ever before. These questions have empirical and normative dimensions that are closely linked, and they are all linked to each other, though they are distinct enough to merit separate mention. The 4 are: first, the question facing citizenship theory, and democratic governance today of appropriately differentiated citizenships. Second, the question of the proper horizon or horizons of political citizenship, whether the horizon of the nation state or other political forms. Third, the question of the character of politically sustainable and normatively appropriate civic bonds, including the means through which they can and should be fostered. And fourth, the question of defining and resolving conflicting civic and personal obligations. I hope these questions are as important as I say they are, because they are central to my current scholarly projects, which may well occupy the rest of my life. The first 2 questions define the themes of the book I have underway that is a sequel to my 1997 book, Civic Ideals, which analyzed American citizenship through the Progressive Era. The book in progress is called Civic Horizons: Pursuing Democratic Citizenship in Modern America, and it analyzes American civic development in the 20th century. The last 2 questions of civic bonds and obligations are central to essays I'm writing and plan to write using the framework I laid out in my 2003 book, Stories of Peoplehood. So, if you tell me these are the wrong questions to ask about citizenship now, I'm likely to push back, but I'll be very interested. The first question of appropriately differentiated citizenship arises for me from the arc of American civic development in the 20th century. But I see it as a central question around the world in every regime that professes to be some kind of modern democracy or republic with citizens, as today most regimes do. This question has become more visible in the U.S. in the course of our modern history. At the dawn of the 20th century, due to the clash of the egalitarian post-Civil War amendments with resurgent doctrines and practices of racial as well as ethnic, gender, religious, and class inequality, American laws were structured in ways that created putatively equal but visibly first and second class forms of citizenship. The second class forms of citizenship were enacted in Jim Crow segregation laws, the related voting tests and poll tax that disfranchised many of the poor and illiterate of all races, in gendered citizenship laws defining domestic spheres or Republican motherhood, in the systems of imperial governance of Spanish-American war territories and Native American reservations, in the segregation by race, gender, class, and religion in many systems of public education throughout the nation and at all levels, and in many more forms. These forms of putatively equal, effectively second-class citizenship led American citizenship struggles in the 20th century to focus most on achieving legally equal citizenship, most often described as unitary or uniform citizenship, citizenship in which all citizens would legally possess exactly the same bundle of rights and duties, especially voting rights, property rights, and due process rights. Separate could not be equal citizenship for the races, for the genders, for any subgroups of citizens. Or so it seemed to many, as the battles to enfranchise women, overthrow segregation laws, and establish national anti-discrimination statutes were fought and won during the first 2/3 of America's 20th century. But even then, many, perhaps even most, who worked on behalf of those causes were not really attracted to, much less committed to, a political society which would be fully colorblind, gender-blind, religion and culture-blind, one in which all citizens were treated as atomistic individuals with identical rights and duties, regardless of other differing features of their identities. The views of figures like Philip Randolph, W.E. Du Bois, and Pauli Murray could not adequately be so described, for example. But they thought the prevailing forms of racial and gender civic differentiation, especially, were clearly unjust. And they joined together under the banner of equal citizenship, widely understood as unitary, uniform citizenship, in order to achieve coalitions potent enough to attack those forms of second-class citizenship with considerable success. But since the last third of the 20th century, an array of empirical realities and normative considerations have become more and more clear. The empirical reality is that neither the U.S. nor any other democratic society ever has had or ever will have fully unitary, uniform legal citizenship. The normative considerations that contribute to this empirical reality are that in many respects it does not seem morally desirable to define meaningfully equal citizenship as unitary, uniform citizenship. These are facts that the very triumphs of civil rights struggles on behalf of equal citizenship can lead us to ignore or deny in ways that ill-equip us to deal with many of the central challenges that democratic civic governance, as well as democratic theories and citizenship theories, face today. The empirical reality that the laws of democratic societies never establish fully uniform, unitary citizenship is easily shown. Any democracy large enough to have cities, states, or provinces and a national government has at least 3 levels of citizenship, and the rights and obligations of citizens are sure to vary somewhat between different cities and states and between those levels and national citizenship. Sometimes quasi-colonial forms of territorial citizenship also exist. Some citizens are native-born, and almost always some are not, and the latter usually face some legal vulnerabilities, the former do not. Some people are able to claim 2 or more legally recognized national citizenships, others are not. The very young and the severely mentally disabled usually do not possess all the rights of other citizens. Citizens with other sorts of disabilities can be disadvantaged by institutions that treat all persons identically, so distinctive accommodations often seem appropriate. For certain limited but far from trivial jurisdictional purposes, corporations are often legally recognized as kinds of citizens, and sometimes they can claim multiple citizenships, but they are obviously not citizens like any others. A particular society's laws also cannot help but to accommodate some religious and cultural practices and sexual orientations more fully than others, and this reality, among others, often leads to successful demands for explicit counterbalancing legal accommodations for various sorts of minority groups. The reality of legal construction of citizenship in all societies, then, is and will always be differentiated citizenships, not fully uniform, unitary citizenship. And the truth is, for many differing and often conflicting reasons, that is the way most people think normatively things ought to be. Many see advantages to having different levels of governance and to permitting diversity in the laws of different cities and states or provinces, even within the same nation-state. Few in any modern democracy agree that it is ideal, just, or beneficial to confine citizenship exclusively to the native-born, even though that's how John Rawls theorized about it. But most also think that those who immigrate and naturalize fraudulently should face some legal sanctions. The native-born do not. Few agree that the very young or severely mentally disabled should possess exactly the same rights as able adults, but many do think special accommodations so that disabled persons can exercise more meaningfully equal citizenship make sense. Most people want legal rules that allow corporations to sue and be sued in turn, and so they find it practical to assign them some limited kinds of legal citizenship. More controversially, some believe on the one hand that some traditional laws privileging certain religious, gender, and even racial and ethnic identities over others remain appropriate. And many believe, on the other hand, that the greatly varying histories unequal current conditions, and the differing aspirations of particular racial, religious, cultural, and economic groups and persons of different sexes and sexual orientations and different disabilities all make it appropriate for laws to treat them differently in some important respects. Many think groups historically subjected to unjust imperial subjugation and or racial, religious, and gender discrimination resulting in economic hardship and social marginalization merit some forms of affirmative aid and accommodation. Some think special accommodations are warranted even for groups that have not experienced past injustices. The philosopher Robert Audi, for example, defends a protection of identity principle, holding that, I quote, "The deeper a set of commitments is in a person, and the closer it comes to determining that person's sense of identity, the stronger the case for protecting the expression of those commitments tends to be, even if this requires exemptions from laws applying to all other citizens or other forms of special treatment." Audi is thinking of exemptions for religious conscience, but he stresses that his principle applies more broadly to any deeply valued identities. We can argue that he therefore is defending a kind of unitary citizenship because everyone is entitled to accommodations for their distinct but deeply valued identities. But in practice, such an approach means that at any given time, citizens will possess bundles of rights and duties that are significantly different from each other in their specific content. Despite this range of normative beliefs and empirical practices of differentiated citizenship, in modern American political rhetoric and in modern political theories more broadly, the bitter historical experiences with legal forms of putatively equal, effectively subordinating second-class citizenship have fostered great resistance, and in many ways salutary resistance, to recognizing the legitimacy of any kind of differentiated citizenship. But my argument today is, understandable as that may be, the time for such resistance is over. We need to recognize that in reality, governments do create and sustain forms of differentiated citizenship, or what political theorist Elizabeth Cohen calls semi-citizenship, all the time. There is always a danger that doing so creates or sustains forms of unjust subordination and domination. There is also always a danger that failing to do so sustains structures of citizenship that are formally legally equal, but that are in reality, for many important purposes, highly unequal civic statuses. I believe that theories of democracy and citizenship must take the question of what kinds of differentiated citizenship are appropriate in various ever-changing contexts as one of their most central questions, as most have not done until now. And I think we need to recognize that one of the central continuing tasks of democratic self-governance is to determine on a continuing basis what kinds of differentiated citizenship are and are not currently appropriate, recognizing that the answers are likely to shift over time and must always be seen as legitimately contestable. So this first question, the question of appropriately differentiated citizenship, is, to my mind, a very big and fundamental one indeed. So is the closely related second question, the issue of the proper horizon or horizons for citizenship. By this I mean, above all, the question of how far and in what ways we should think about citizenship in the 21st century, not primarily and paradigmatically as membership in a sovereign nation state, and should instead think of citizenship far more extensively as involving membership in other sorts of political communities, or indeed multiple political communities, all of which claim some authority, but none of which presents itself as fully sovereign. I will spend less time on this question because the literature has gone through a cycle on this topic with which many of you will be familiar. In the late 1980s and 1990s, various works by scholars, including Yasmin Soysal, David Held, and others, began to proclaim that the era of the nation-state was over, that we were seeing simultaneous moves toward new transnational forms of political community like the European Union and new forms of devolution such as the establishment of greater autonomy for Scotland and Wales in the UK and Catalonia in Spain. Some, like Held and his co-authors, celebrated these developments as steps toward a cosmopolitan world federation that would be governed by the old Catholic principle of subsidiarity. Problems would be dealt with by the most local level of democratic government capable of resolving them. Others, like Saskia Sassen, quickly pointed out that we were seeing transnational arrangements that benefited cosmopolitan elites who resided in multiple global cities and benefited from the transnational labor of poor migrants, as well as transnational movements of capital. But these sorts of transnational cosmopolitan arrangements did not obviously promote either economic or political equality. And soon, a wave of countering scholarship argued that it was, in any case, highly premature to proclaim anything approaching the death of nation-states. Such states, these scholars contend, still decisively shape transnational and subnational political associations and remain hegemonic in structuring citizenship and much else, even if they are far from uncontested. I agree that the era of the predominance of nation-states is not ended, but I am also conscious that this predominance is in fact a relatively recent development in world history. The age of religious and secular multinational empires is not long or even entirely past. And I'm aware that nation-states have not been, even in the last century, the only form of political community, and that they are indeed undergoing a range of challenges and transformations. The book to which we are giving the Center's New Book Award tomorrow, Jonas Steinberg's Ismaili Modern, provides a fascinating account of how, with the initial aid of the British Empire in the 19th century, the Ismaili Muslim sect, led by the Aga Khans, has formed a globe-spanning, relatively wealthy, transnational community with its own constitution, laws, and educational, cultural, political, and economic institutions. Its more than 2 million members are supposed to abide by the laws of the nation-states in which they reside, but often they are more effectively governed through their distinctive Ismaili institutions, and many of them feel themselves Ismaili first. Tajik or Pakistani or Kenyan or English or French decidedly second. And though it's true that the project of the European Union that excited many scholars in the 1980s and 1990s has now stumbled over the nationalistic opposition of many of its members, many of us North Atlantic scholars have neglected other examples of rising transnational citizenships. For instance, at its recent 6th summit in November 2012, the Union of South American Nations, representing Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, Suriname, Uruguay, and Venezuela, they all approved a process to advance, quote, in a flexible and gradual manner toward the consolidating of the South American identity with the aim of attaining a true South American citizenship as the backbone of an integrated South American space. Some leaders hope to establish formal legal South American citizenship within the next 10 years. Whether this will happen is, of course, an open question. But my point is that there are indeed a range of developments that raise pressing empirical questions as to whether and why the nation-state, as the horizon of the most important forms of citizenship, may be giving way to new forms of political association, and what those new forms will be or should be. I say should be because these empirical developments are accompanied by perhaps even more pressing normative questions about whether the organization of the world, primarily as a Westphalian system of sovereign nation-states, is as desirable from the standpoint of promoting egalitarian democratic citizenship and material well-being as other possible arrangements might prove to be. I've argued normatively in favor of seeking to transform our nation-state political memberships into interlocking sets of more fluid and overlapping semi-sovereign democratic communities of various sorts. But I have many doubts about how empirically feasible and normatively desirable this trajectory really is. So my point now is simply that the question of the appropriate horizon or horizons for citizenship in its manifold empirical and normative dimensions has to be central to our agendas today. The third major question is the question of what sorts of bonds can and should serve to hold together political communities and inspire civic engagement, especially in the transformed and transforming world of the 21st century, and how those bonds can and should be generated. It seems beyond empirical or normative dispute that we need to structure the world in terms of some sorts of political societies with some sorts of governing institutions if we're to create conditions in which human beings can flourish. And whatever sorts of societies we have will need the willing allegiance and active cooperation of many of their members if they're to prove sustainable. But we have lots of empirical evidence that many of the ways political leaders and governments seek to foster allegiance either can fail to work to inspire sufficient cooperation to make the society function well, or alternatively can stir up extreme forms of loyalty so chauvinistic that they're accompanied by harsh, unjust policies toward non-members. Many have hoped that modern forms of democratic or republican citizenship might prove to be bonded only by civic conceptions of constitutional patriotism, by loyalty to principles of equality and freedom that are not accompanied by such chauvinistic nationalism. But experience has not given much basis for confidence that such purely civic bonds of political community are really empirically sufficient to sustain regimes. The sociologist John Lye has argued that, in fact, the dominant forms of modern peoplehood fostered by modern nation states are inclusionary but involuntary forms of group identity based on ascriptive categories, especially race, ethnicity, and native-born nationality. He believes the very complexities of modern life make such simplified involuntary conceptions of peoplehood politically appealing and powerful, but they are obviously susceptible to becoming inflamed into virulent racism and xenophobia. Now, I think that John Lye understates the range of forms of peoplehood that are empirically present in the modern world, and to some degree, he unduly contrasts them with previous forms of political membership. But that only makes me feel more strongly that a central question for modern citizenship is whether it is empirically possible to define and generate bonds of civic membership that work to achieve the good things political societies can do without being easily distorted into unjust chauvinism of one sort or another. There are many ways to get at this question, such as studies of civic education, but I've been exploring the question by examining different sorts of stories of peoplehood told by political leaders. And I want to illustrate the issues under this third topic by citing the stories of American peoplehood told explicitly using that language by the last two presidents of the United States. So first, the story of American peoplehood told by President George W. Bush in his first inaugural address in 2001. He said, and I quote, "After the Declaration of Independence was signed, Virginia statesman John Page wrote to Thomas Jefferson, 'We know the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Do you not think an angel rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm?' Much time has passed," Bush said, "since Jefferson arrived for his inauguration. The years and changes accumulate. But the themes of this day he would know, our nation's grand story of courage and its simple dream of dignity." We are not this story's author who fills time and eternity with his purpose, yet his purpose is achieved in our duty, and our duty is fulfilled in service to one another. Never tiring, never yielding, never finishing, we renew that purpose today to make our country more just and generous, to affirm the dignity of our lives and every life. This work continues, this story goes on, and an angel still rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm. That's George W. Bush's story. Contrast that with that of President Barack Obama in his most recent State of the Union address. He concluded there, and I quote, "We may do different jobs and wear different uniforms and hold different views than the person beside us. But as Americans, we all share the same proud title. We are citizens. It's a word that doesn't just describe our nationality or legal status. It describes the way we're made. It describes what we believe. It captures the enduring idea that this country only works when we accept certain obligations to one another and to future generations, that our rights are wrapped up in the rights of others, and that well into our third century as a nation, it remains the task of us all as citizens of these United States to be the authors of the next great chapter in our American story. The contrast will be clear. Bush tells Americans that they are not the ultimate authors of the American story. A divine providence is. Obama instead tells Americans that they, as citizens, are indeed the authors of the American story. Obama's position is more consistent with Democratic or Republican or civic or constitutional patriotism conceptions of civic bonds, while Bush's view may seem dangerously providentialist. I've argued that it is. But notice two things. Even Obama does not define our citizenship solely as a matter of legal nationality, and he in fact comes close to essentializing it, saying citizenship describes the way we are made. What does this mean? There's a hint here of a kind of republicanism that says we achieve our highest human potential through active self-governance, as well as a hint of Christian social gospel doctrines holding that we realize our best selves through service to each other. But there's also a hint of doctrines suggesting that Americans are uniquely suited for such Republican citizenship. Such citizenship is who we as Americans are, not who we as human beings are, or so it can easily seem. Even Obama's speech, then, suggests that political leaders find it empirically necessary to tell their fellow citizens what I've called a constitutive story, an account that makes membership in their distinctive society seem integral to their personal identities in ways they find normatively valuable, and in ways that has a more particular content than simply allegiance to civic principles of democracy, constitutionalism, and the rule of law, and human rights. And all such constitutive stories, Obama's as well as Bush's, have at least some xenophobic or chauvinistic potential. How can we find bonds of citizenship that can work empirically to tie political communities together without falling prey to such dark potential? How can we foster memberships that instead grow more egalitarian and inclusive over time without losing their power to inspire needed allegiances and civic engagement? That, again, is the third big question of modern citizenship. And I think it looms all the larger precisely because the primacy of nation states is being challenged and many more forms of political community are arising and claiming at least some of our allegiances, using every sort of appeal they can, for good and ill. This brings me to my fourth, final, briefest, and also oldest and most perennial question of citizenship. It arises from the certainty that however the first three big questions are answered, however we seek to foster appropriately differentiated forms of citizenship, however we define the appropriate forms or horizons of our civic community or communities, however we define the bonds of those communities seeking healthy loyalty but not dangerous chauvinism, our answers will always be imperfect. They will be unsatisfying even to many who support them, as well as to the many who will surely oppose them. The social and political processes of citizenship construction, contestation, and transformation will therefore continue. And so we as individuals will be faced to some degree every day, and some days very acutely, with an ethical dilemma that goes back beyond St. Augustine, at least to Socrates. Given that our current forms of civic community, however defensible, however seemingly necessary, are nonetheless imperfect, how far and in what ways should we give them, their values, principles, policies, and institutions, all the obedience and service they demand and undoubtedly often need if they're to do whatever good they are capable of doing? How far instead do we decide that we have other, higher obligations and act on them What do we do when our senses of our duties as good citizens conflict with our senses of our duties as good human beings? As scholars of citizenship who probably recognize more than most others how constructed, fragile, imperfect, but often valuable our forms of civic community are, it's incumbent on us to explore more fully and carefully than most the very wide range of empirical and normative issues involved in deciding what forms of citizenship can and should be sustained or resisted through conscientious objection in one way or another. And if we wish not only to be good scholars, but also good people, we must also address those issues as questions we seek to answer as well as we can, not just for our students and the readers of our works, but for ourselves in our own personal lives and actions. For me, at least, it is part of the great promise and appeal of the study of citizenship in the 21st century that it may help us approach better answers to all of these large questions of citizenship, but perhaps especially this last question, shedding insight not only into what citizens in general can be and how they should live, but into what we can be and how we should live as human beings inescapably engaged in conceiving and constructing and inhabiting much needed but always imperfect forms of citizenship. Thank you. I have a younger colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, political theorist Jeff Green, whose second book project now underway is a challenge to the forms of liberal democratic theory inspired by Rawls that focus on obligations to the least advantaged. He wants to focus on the obligations of the most advantaged. He wants to focus on precisely the questions of what kinds of contributions and service can and should be demanded of the wealthy. Now, why is he asking that question today? It is because for scholars, I think this is a depressing fact, and it's depressing for larger reasons as well. But if you reflect on it, Theory of Justice was published in 1971. The central normative message of this work, almost certainly the most influential work in Anglo-American political theory in the last 40 years, the central message was that economic inequalities could only be justified if you showed they served the least advantaged. While this book was having such a predominant role in academic debates, the levels of economic inequality skyrocketed in the United States and in much of the rest of the developed world in ways that I don't think can remotely be defended as to the benefit of the least advantaged. So the world went in exactly the opposite way, showing perhaps the feebleness of the scholarship in relation to other forces in shaping development. And with that warning, the question of what can we do to address such developments is clearly a daunting one. But I think Jeff's choice is a choice that is echoed in the work of a number of other scholars and perhaps more importantly, a work of a number of social and political movements today, precisely because economic inequality has risen so much, and precisely because it is hard to say that the less advantaged are benefiting in this society and in many other societies, as in Europe today. You have a political context in which there can be more pressure to bear brought on the wealthy to make sure that their privileges and levels of inequality are justified. But my worry is that we got that in this country, we got some move in this direction only as the result of the Great Depression, which created massive political movements that worked toward equalization.
Or the draft. You know, there are many institutional forms.
Right, forms. And in one of my books, my co-author talked me into endorsing a kind of universal national service proposal. I've always been ambivalent about it because I'm a Vietnam era guy, and you know, we weren't for military service, a lot of us. But there is a case there is a case to be made. I know I'm going on, but I'll mention this because we're in this setting. When I was an undergraduate at Michigan State University, I worked for the Michigan Public Service Commission, the State Utility Regulation Commission, and there was this big expose in the Detroit Free Press. The president of Consumer Power was making 10 times, he was making $200,000 a year, whereas the average worker was making only $20,000 a year. And they said, how can you justify this stunning level of inequality, $200,000 versus $20,000? Now, of course, he's probably making $20 million a year. So, these are powerful patterns. I agree with you that thinking about how they can be addressed and, in my view, resisted is important. Yes, sir.
Let me raise something that is a foundational point, let's say, and that is I don't think the differentiated citizenship takes seriously enough the crisis and our thinking about the theory and practice of citizenship. It's somewhat similar to the way in which the public sphere was conceptualized by Habermas, and then people like Nancy Fraser and others said, well, wait a second, that's the bourgeois public sphere. We need to think about other ways of reconstituting it, both theoretically and practically. Which is to say that I think differentiated citizenship really in the crisis that we've been talking about, inequality, and meeting here in Detroit with the imposition of an authoritarian politics of austerity through an emergency financial manager would suggest something to the effect of a deformed as opposed to differentiated citizenship. In other words, to bring into their Sheldon Wollin's book on inverted totalitarianism. In other words, the way in which spectacle or hollow citizenship has both its political forms and economic forms. So that when we really think about citizenship anymore, it's a spectacle, as you know, in many respects, and it has been in effect with the politics of austerity, particularly cities in Michigan, has been dispensed with entirely. So well, the issue is the larger crisis of how we consider citizenship, and the differentiated, as I'm suggesting, may not do as much justice to a crisis as something like the form.
I appreciate the point, but I'd say two things. First, many forms of differentiated citizenship, past and present, including class differentiation, are clearly appalling and deplorable. The language of differentiated citizenship may be less dramatic than the language of deformed and hollow citizenship, but you can certainly make the arguments that these kinds of differentiations are unjust, invidious, damaging in lots of ways. The reason I prefer to use the language of differentiated citizenship is because I worry that if you rush quickly to talking about what we have in specific negative terms, you are failing to call attention to this great intellectual and political challenge of figuring out what forms of differentiation are unjust, invidious, and should be denounced, and what forms of differentiation are desirable. You're sort of using language that suggests you already have all the answers to that question. And I think it is a very difficult question, both in theory and practice, that we need to focus on more clearly. So I want the language of differentiated citizenship in order to get us to think. What forms of differentiation do we condemn? What forms of differentiation do we applaud? If we just say, oh, we have deformed citizenship now, that's like, well, we know what healthy, good citizenship looks like. And my point is, we don't, and that the answers to what good citizenship looks like can and should change under different conditions. Different kinds of accommodations are appropriate at one time and not another. You've been waiting the longest, so I'll get you in and then I'll move around more. So.
Thank you. First, I appreciate that conceptualization of citizenship. I've never heard it put so coherently. It's such a short space of time. I feel like I just read 40 books all at once, so thank you. But the question is, from your description, when these putting these questions together, it seems like citizenship is a very messy thing.
Oh yeah.
And what I would ask you is I think the messiness is a good thing insofar as the messiness goes hand in hand with a kind of flexibility or fluidity in citizenship. If you can sort of comment on that relation, that connection between the messiness and the fluidity, and if you think the fluidity is a good thing. And a related question, it seems like it's always seemed to me that in the discussions over citizenship in various forms, a central feature in using citizenship as something positive is a kind of equality of opportunities. You don't have to do away with all sorts of differences as long as there's some level of equality of opportunity, and that's where the fluidity comes in, where there's a lack of equality of opportunity. You can have a group or the state, someone step into a level of that field, but as long as how central is this equality of opportunity in dealing with this, messy situation and preserving the fluidity?
Okay, I agree with both those points. They still leave lots of work to be done. My first preliminary was that the term citizenship gets used in lots of different ways, and that was an implicit plea not to do what no papers here that I've read so far do, but scholars do sometimes, to say, well, really, citizenship just is legal nationality and nothing else, and everything else is just metaphorical. Or there are people who say, oh, those abstract legal categories, they don't capture the lived, rich experience of everyday life, and that's what real citizenship is, living together. And those, I think, tend to be not very fruitful academic debates. You may want to focus on one phenomenon or another, but you ought to recognize that the term citizenship has many fluid, different meanings, and it is part of the phenomena of citizenship in the world that these meanings feed into each other, and often in ways that are salutary in that they imply an ethos of concern and service for others in many different contexts, and I tend to think of that as good, although it isn't. There is some confusion and some cost to valorizing citizenship above all else. Then it can work against rights of personhood as well as other kinds of normative claims. So even the multiple and fluid meanings can have a downside. And I agree that the challenge of constructing differentiated citizenship should be aiming at some sort of equality of opportunity. Unfortunately, that phrase doesn't help solve many problems. What constitutes genuine equality of opportunity? There's a wide range of empirical normative perspectives on it. It is something to bear in mind as we think about appropriate structures of citizenship, but we're going to get into debates whether any particular set of arrangements really represents equality of opportunity or not, and we just have to engage those debates.
Don't you think Montesquieu had it right? He said that, in the spirit of the law, insofar as every country is different based on a variety of factors, the notion of citizenship, or maybe the ideal citizenship that should be striven towards in each country will also vary.
Yes, I do think that the proper resolutions to the appropriate forms of differentiated citizenship are contextual as well as evolving. That is, take, for example, the question of the relationship of government to religious communities and identities. You want to get an arrangement, I think, in which religious communities don't feel oppressed, they feel they can flourish, religious disputes don't inflame and damage political processes from meeting a range of other human goals, but the arrangement of church-state relations that will produce that result is going to vary in different contexts with different traditions and different arrays of religious groups. So it is not one size fits all. It's, again, differentiated citizenship, including in different national and regional contexts. So, yeah.
So I'm wondering if you've thought about, I'm sure you have, but I'm wondering if you speak a little bit to the potential sort of danger that I'm very much on board with. I really like the way you frame the challenge of thinking about differentiated citizenship, and one of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking is that there's a lot of sort of interesting work that addresses very little pieces of this, and it hasn't been, this is a long way to go in terms of theorizing this as a larger practice
Right.
and coming up with some larger principles for it. But one thing that struck me just hearing you put these different challenges together is the way in which your first and your third imperatives might potentially work against each other.
Yes.
Right? And the mythology of the civil rights movement and other inclusionary movements of a shared unitary vision of citizenship that is our goal might be a sort of really important tool in the kinds of in the ways we might generate these kinds of bonds. And as we sort of wake up and face reality and realize that unitary citizenship is in fact a myth, and we have to take seriously, one slice of the partial citizenship literature I was just in one of my classes I was looking at is Jeff Stinner-Hollis' discussion of the Amish.
Right.
And the way he conceptualized their version of partial citizenship, it's almost necessary that they are not part of our bonds. That's part of the definition, part of the larger national bond. That's part of the definition of their version So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the ways in which you see that tension between those two imperatives.
Definitely a tension. I think that the path of direction is to try to recognize that the civic bonds can come through the different kinds of contributions that people who are living out differentiated forms of citizenship nonetheless are making to society. This is the line that Chief Justice Berger took toward the Amish in the famous Wisconsin v. Yoder decision, in which he granted them special exemptions from civic education because he said, oh, they're such good citizens in so many other ways, and they're my neighbors in Pennsylvania, so I see the healthy, wholesome farm products and all that. But at the same time, the Supreme Court eventually had to back away from the extent of special privileging of the Amish if that was not to become divisive, if not to cut against civic bonds. And the need to foster a sense of unity, therefore, can work against recognition of differentiation, and it may have to sometime. I was quite struck in this morning paper. Barack Obama, of course, is over in Israel. He's trying to convince Israelis that he really cares about them. And so he says, the quote was, we are permanently bonded because we have the same story. We're both immigrant societies that have learned to live with diversity. Well, that's a way of generating bonds, but it effaces some very important differences in ways that can be disturbing. So you're right about the tension. Yeah?
It is, I think, probably going to be a consensus of your audience that laid out in terms of the template of a sort of great idea book today, as the commentator back there said, is unassailable. I mean, the synthesis is wonderful, and it's really spurring me to think. And one of the ways in which it's spurring me to think is that I wonder if you underestimate the power or the hold of the positive law and positive legal institutions in driving debates about citizenship. And here's just the most sort of present example. The Supreme Court just heard arguments in the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act case in which we have justices from the bench saying that the right to vote has essentially been exaggerated as an aspect of citizenship. I mean, we know what Justice Scalia said. And at the same time, we also know from what's been reported about the election last November that part of citizenship, the exercise of the franchise, is very much differentiated. It's not uniform.
Right.
It very much depends on place. It depends on identity. So, how do you fold that cognitive dissonance into the project that you laid out? Do we exercise patience with the Supreme Court if the decision goes in a way we don't like, if we're sort of pro-franchise and pro-egalitarian participation, and hope that in 20 or 30 years they'll reconsider, or hope that Congress
Okay, a couple of responses. First, I see it as a legitimate empirical question how much political and legal institutions and governing practices shape human experience more generally. There's a debate over how important these things are, and it's a legitimate debate. In research, we should try to advance and test different claims about how important these institutions are. But second, in my work, I'm entirely on the side that they are tremendously important. You know, I have focused extensively on Supreme Court decisions and on statutes in my work, so much so that, you know, people say, Smith only looks at citizenship top down from a narrow political legal point of view and never, you know, pays attention to how real people lead their lives. And it's true, I haven't done that kind of rich and more ethnographic work the way many of you here have, and I'm an avid consumer of that scholarship. But in my talk, the way you hear me always say, social and political construction of citizenship, I do it precisely because I happen to think, based on my work, that the political structuring is tremendously important, and that what happens with the Voting Rights Act matters a whole lot. I'm probably more guilty of exaggerating that importance than minimizing it. As I say, it's an empirical question. Now, what to do based on how the Supreme Court rules on the Voting Rights Act, that, of course, is a question of judgment of civic engagement. I think that given the political appeal of the Voting Rights Act, don't forget that in the late 1970s, in Mobile versus Bolden, the Supreme Court interpreted the Voting Rights Act as requiring racially discriminatory intent before you could challenge voting arrangements that effectively diluted the votes of racial and ethnic minorities. And even in the Reagan years, the Congress overrode that. And so I think that there is hope through the political processes that any gutting of the Voting Rights Act might be addressed effectively. Yeah.
I would like to follow up on your notion of appropriately differentiated citizenship.
Right.
And I wonder if you believe there is an inherent problem with democracy to create inappropriately differentiated citizenship insofar as those with political power are always going to try to use the system to favor themselves and thereby create this inappropriately differentiated citizenship at the expense of equality and justice.
Yes. And it is a constant challenge to try to combat that. Again, in my book, Stories of Peoplehood, that gets criticized because I talk so much, as I did today, about how leaders advance stories of peoplehood, and people want to say, which is quite true, but look, there's lots of agency, a lot of stories being told that challenge those of the leaders, and that's true. The leaders have to tell stories that resonate with constituents, but I focused on the leaders because they are likely to tell stories that justify policies and institutions that favor them against others, and I wanted to shine a spotlight on it precisely for those reasons. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Thanks. Following the discussion on perfect citizen, well, don't you think that there is a contradiction in terms when we ask to migrants to be a perfect citizen, maybe with the integration for integration or to get citizenship, while we don't do it for citizen. So there is this double measure. And also, if I can, on your third comment about active citizenship at the end. What is your observation, what is your decision on the idea of using e-tool in democracy, electronic tools? For example, just very recently in Italy, there is this new party, the Grillo, and then you see that there is a really huge participation in e-tools, in platforms, but don't you think that this, well, what is your position? Because sometimes from my perspective it can be only not a first be selective and only parts of the population can access, have the knowledge and so on to participate. And on the second side, well, this at the end can be only an imaginary tool, and there will be always a sort of deus ex machina that who will decide for no matter who the other of these really faces.
Well, I'm in sympathy with both those points. On the first, the notion that we demand of those who are seeking to gain citizenship through naturalization a kind of knowledge and integration that we don't demand of the native born. The traditional answer to that is, oh, but if you grow up and live here, you absorb it by osmosis. That's one answer. And the other answer is to say, well, it is probably too intrusive and unfair to begin testing people who are already here, but people who are seeking entry, they should have to pay an extra price of proving their worth in this way. Those are the answers. I don't find them overwhelmingly compelling. I am worried about kinds of civic education that move unduly in the direction of indoctrination of loyalty to the regime. So I don't worry too much about the fact that citizens don't get some kinds of civic education. But it is a kind of differentiation in our structure of citizenship that is of some legitimate normative concern. I think there are other differentiations that worry me more, but that is still worth considering. Now, as far as how the electronic cybernetic revolution is going to affect democratic citizenship, there's of course a lot of research and writing going on about this. There was an enthusiastic wave of scholarship that this is going to promote democracy because everybody who has access to the internet can participate, and the presumption was participate in an egalitarian way. Then we've had writing throwing cold water on that, saying, number one, not everybody does have access to the internet or the capacity to use the internet effectively, and that if you look at the new forms of political communication and mobilization that are taking place through the internet, it's the more affluent and educated who often are playing the leading roles. You're reproducing inequalities in cyberspace, political communication and organization. You're not eliminating them. Nonetheless, there are some things going on the other way. There is not only the question of how far internet communications assisted in the mobilizing of in the Arab Spring. Some say a lot, some say not at all, but the truth may be somewhere in between, in which case it might have contributed to some kinds of democratic mobilization. One of my former students, Dave Karpf, who now teaches at George Washington, his book argues that yes, it's true that mobilization via the internet often involves continuing inequalities between leaders and followers, and the more affluent and educated tend to be the leader. But his book on the MoveOn.org phenomenon argues that nonetheless it's true that because of the lowering of costs of participation, we are seeing some kinds of electronic political communities that can organize, especially for fundraising, but also for real-world mass meetings that we didn't have before. And in the political science literature, there's a standard story now that we used to have mass membership federated societies through which people got political experience in the late 19th and early 20th century. By the end of the 1960s, our mass organizations didn't have any real members. They were just computer mailing lists where people gave money and didn't get actively involved. Theta Scotchpool and Robert Putnam have lamented this in different ways. In comparison with that, in the MoveOn.org type phenomenon, the blogosphere, et cetera, there are more opportunities for more people to get involved, both in political communication and in real-world activities, than those forms of elite-led advocacy group organization tended to provide. So I think it's not clear at this point what the consequences of this will be for democratic life, and it's a very important question.